Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Claire Byrne, and I am the Community Manager for RSA US. So on behalf of myself, Mike, Aisha, Carly, and the RSA US team, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this month's US Salon, What We've Lost, Creativity and COVID-19. So before I get started, I'd just like to give a little bit of a background on the RSA US, and just cover some kind of ground rules or some housekeeping for this event. So founded in the UK, in case you don't know the RSA's history, we have been founded in the UK, and the RSA stands for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, and has been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. And today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven social change organization. So we are committed to a future that works for everyone, a future where everybody can participate in its creation, and our proven change process, rigorous research, innovative ideas platforms, and diverse global community of over 30,000 problem solvers deliver solutions for lasting change. Of those 30,000, oh my gosh, put my tea back in. Of those 30,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,100 live and work here in the United States, including Mike. Aisha used to live in the US, but she can tell you where she's based and what she's up to in a little minute. And Carly is joining us from the UK. So RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. So before I turn things over to our speakers today and get the conversation going, I'd like to cover just a few little points about today's event, which hopefully are useful, just because this is an important conversation and just to make sure we're all in the same headspace. So this event is being recorded, just to flag that with you all, and you will have access to the recording hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. This is an informal and very inclusive space. We really do want this to be a collaborative conversation. We do want to hear from you as we're chatting, and also just want to make sure that everybody feels included in this conversation. Goes without saying to be respectful and use language that your mother or your mum, or as I always say at these events in our back home in Ireland, we'd say my mum, would approve of. So just please be respectful. Bring a spirit of collaboration, free from judgment or monopolizing the conversation. I think that's hugely important for these very informal salons that we run. And then being respectful of each other's time, boundaries, and feedback. And as I said before, the chat is available to you, so feel free to pop your questions into the chat and message me directly at RSA US Events, and I'd be happy to feed off your questions or get back to you that way. So that's absolutely no problem. And I would love to introduce you to our speakers for today with super impressive bios that would probably take me way too long to read through, but I hope to give you a bit of a flavor of who we have in the room with us today. So really delighted to welcome Michael O'Brien with us, Aisha Fukushima and Carly Attridge. So kicking off with Mike, okay if I call you Mike. Of course. So Mike is the founder of design strategy firm Humanature, and he's a practitioner and researcher in the fields of community development, organizational culture, and human well-being. He is an advocate for human rights and social change with an approach that pulls from developmental science research, including trauma theory, and his own hands-on programmatic experience working in historically excluded communities. So at Humanature, he works with a mixture of nonprofits, business, government agencies on transforming how they understand and support human development, interaction, and performance. He is a distinguished resident fellow at Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation, a lecturer in city planning at the University of Pennsylvania's Stuart Wiseman School of Design as well. And recently, Michael was awarded the 2022 Diversity in Business Award by the Philadelphia Business Journal. Whew. Welcome, Michael. I'm going to add you as a wee spotlight there so that everybody can see your face. So welcome, Michael. And it's really, really great to have you in the room with us today. And I'm also just going to introduce you now to Aisha, who is a performance lecturer, Aisha Fukushima, a justice strategist, singer-songwriter, RAPtivist, who set up RAPtivism, if I'm getting that right. Aisha founded RAPtivism, a hip-hop project spanning 20 countries, 4 continents, amplifying universal efforts for freedom and justice. And she is a multilingual, multiracial, African-American, Japanese woman who has performed everywhere from the United States to France, Morocco, Japan, Germany, England, South Africa, Senegal, India, Denmark, and beyond. Wow, traveled a lot. I love it. Fukushima's RAPtivism work has been featured on the likes of Oprah Magazine, TEDx, Seattle Times, TV2M, Morocco, the Bangalore Mirror, Hype, and so many more. Some of her tour highlights include performing for audiences in Nepal, speaking with the president of Estonia about the power of music to create change, sharing stories with the likes of a super impressive lineup of people: Bernie Sanders, Angela Davis, Emory Douglas from Black Panthers, KRS-One, Herbie Hancock. I could go on. So many people. And as a public speaker, Aisha combines the art of performance and lecture. So really, really excited to have you join us today, Aisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And lastly, I am really delighted to welcome Carly all the way from the UK joining us today. So Carly Attridge is a creative social entrepreneur who brings a wealth of experience in designing and developing community-led innovation programs across the UK. Carly's work focuses on curating and facilitating spaces for connection, creativity, and self-growth. And she has led an award-winning end-of-life and social isolation program in the hospice sector, scaling a project born in East London with 11 other hospices, and believes that we all need alternative spaces to be able to explore and process grief, loss, and tough times in our lives. So Carly is the founder of the Loss Project, a social enterprise that uses creativity and the arts to support communities to acknowledge, process, and explore grief and loss. She was recently celebrated in the Social Entrepreneur Index of 2022. Welcome, Carly. So excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much. Oof. Such an impressive panel of speakers. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that you can all start the conversation, have a really good chat, and hopefully stop listening to me. I am really excited to kind of start the conversation by just putting it out there of, firstly, what does creativity, like, or how does it show up in your life? Like, how do you consider yourself creative? And what does that look like? And then secondly, what does creative loss mean for you? Or what does creative loss show up like in your life? So I'm handing it over to you as I sort myself out here with the old Zoom technicalities. And I'll hand it over to you, Aisha, if you don't mind kicking things off.
Sure. Wow. Well, creativity, what comes to mind is I remember sitting down and having an amazing conversation with jazz musician / intellectual, among all the things, Vijay Iyer. And I remember him talking about how every breath is a new iteration, like every breath can be like jazz, so to speak. Every word that we speak, our daily lives, in some capacity, there's an improv element. There's something that kind of iterates itself over time. And so I think my definition or my idea of creativity is very much kind of intertwined with a whole lifestyle, and that each breath that we take, each step that we take, the way that we live from moment to moment is a form of jazz, especially among more challenging moments. And sometimes we can also cultivate beauty or expression that connects the fabric of humanity with our stories in really beautiful ways. And I think that connectivity, that kind of fabric, is part of the artistic version of creativity, even though I think creativity flows through all of us in different shapes or forms. So I bring up that larger definition because I think in my daily life, then I try to bring that into the thread of mindfulness and spaciousness that can create room for me to vocalize, to make beats, to collaborate with people, both musically and through storytelling and public speaking, in ways that creates narratives that hopefully fill spaces that people feel like they haven't had enough connectivity yet in. That is to say, like finding ways to connect the dots between different stories in unconventional ways through that jazz of daily life in order to allow us to feel more connected and to find a praxis towards social justice, towards coming together, especially amidst all the things that we've experienced during these pandemic times. So yeah, that's at least a start of my thoughts on creativity.
Oh, that's
Passing
great.
the mic.
Yeah, over to you, Mike or Carly.
Carly, would you like to go? Me? Oh, okay, fair. Maybe I was stalling. No, I appreciate that answer, particularly on the breath and jazz. It's so interesting, right? To really consider like what is creativity, and then how does it show up in our lives? Because I do think there's a pursuit of understanding creativity from a very academic perspective that I have engaged, and then this pursuit of understanding creativity from the end of artistic practice And I've engaged that. I went to performing arts high school. I went to college and did my undergrad in music. My performing arts high school was a theater major. And so I've been way too involved in this really formalized study of creativity on both ends. And I say way too involved because I think actually being human is in itself a creative activity, like managing and living through day-to-day decision making, problem solving, like all of it's a creative activity. And so I actually found myself over time going, well, Michael, what is creativity not? Like I started defining it in negation because it actually helped me in a different way in terms of a lot of sense making. And so I'll just share some of my thoughts there. Like creativity isn't stifling. That doesn't mean there aren't constraints, right? And anything you do, there are liberties, there are constraints. Not all liberties are good, not all constraints are bad. I think every creative thinker, problem solver knows that sometimes a couple of constraints actually unleashes this like unbridled amount of creativity that you can then deploy in service of solving a problem or in service of, you know, just bringing more joy to a space or whatever the goal is that you're trying to accomplish. But what I do understand about creativity is it's not stifling. Like you actually can't have creativity by smothering out energy and fire or curiosity, right? I think the other thing about, and that shows up in my day, in my life every day, right? I'm insatiably curious, ask a million questions. I have to stop myself from asking questions sometimes because it can be, I know for some people it's like overwhelming. It's like, yeah, stop. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just curious. And so I have to learn how to handle my clients with care. I've learned that over the years, right? Of just like slowing the pacing down. But I'm insatiably curious, and I think that is a huge part of how my creativity shows up. I'd say the other space around like what creativity isn't is that it's not a singular event or it's not a solo thing. It's not like a solo practitioners based phenomenon. Like we love this idea of like the person in a lab in a room by themselves with a canvas or, you know, beakers and mixing things and like, I figured it out. And like that's just not how creativity works at all, right? That's not how our humanity works, actually, right? Like, and so creativity is a distributed thing amongst networks and people and ideas, and it's the sharing back and forth, both conscious and unconscious, that actually somewhere in the middle of all that movement, the energy of movement and sharing and combining and destroying and building up again of the way that knowledge and information and networks work, somewhere in the midst of all that transformative stuff and transference, creativity is emerging. And so I'll end there as like, I think, again, creativity is not stifling and creativity is not solo, which means creativity is naturally generative. I think to phrase it in the opposite, right? Creativity is generative, it's inviting, it's engaging, it's exploratory, and then on the other end, it's connected, it's enmeshed and involved and subsumed in life and people and history and future and now. And those things, one, get me excited, and two, I think shape how I approach everything.
Oof, that was a lot. And I'm on board with it 100%. I'd love to get Carly's take on what creativity means to you, how it shows up in your life, or anything you want to kind of riff off with what Aisha and Mike have said.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was literally hanging off of both of your every word. I really loved that sense of, spaciousness and exploring and connectivity. And I think it stumped me a little bit earlier on when I was pondering this. What does kind of creativity mean for me? Or what does it mean? Like you said, Mike, you know, the pursuit of really defining and understanding what creativity mean is more than a lifetime's worth of work. But I think for me, it is about connecting with myself and then connecting with others. There's maybe a rediscovery or a curiosity, like you say. There's a sense of liberation. And it may not necessarily mean a creative practice or a medium like music or visual arts or collage or whatever. It's an innate sense of yourself and a way of being. people have asked me before in relation to the Loss Project, oh, great, so what's your creative practice then? And I'm like, well, this whole thing is it, right? Like everything we're doing right now this is a thing. Sometimes we might use different tools as a way into that, but this is it. And the other thing I think is that for me, there's something about holding space. Creativity holds space for complexity and nuance. So grief can coexist with joy, loss can coexist with gain. And I think creativity is a great way of being able to process and understand and kind of explore some of that, because sometimes on paper or through personal experiences, that can feel quite affronting to be able to hold all of those things at the same time. And I think creativity and the arts are an opportunity to be able to do that. But I think the key thing for me is definitely that sense of connectivity through yourself and with others, and that kind of essence of being human. And yeah, I love that kind of what Mike was saying about a collective energy that really resonated with me. But also I think in my work, and for me personally, it really is a way of seeing alternative spaces, alternative ways of being and doing, and kind of exploring what the alternative might be, what the opportunities are, not necessarily just taking it as the status quo. Yeah,
that's great.
That's me.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I know that when we were chatting about this event and talking about kind of creative loss, like where to even start with unpacking that? Like, like how does that show up in your life? I know we're talking about creativity, but like, what does creative loss mean for you? Like if we're talking about creative practice, or we're talking about kind of human connections and networks and this transformative aspect of kind of creativity, would you be able to speak a little bit about creative loss and the loss and the gain and the double-edged sword of that? I'd really love to hear your perspectives on that. And Carly, if you want to kick it off, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I think we were saying earlier before we started how important it is to be able to hold both sides of that it's not just about the loss, it's also about the gains. And during the pandemic, one of the key things that I noticed was that we'd done so much work face to face, and being able to be in a room with people, that kind of spark you get when you're in a physical space together, was quite difficult to recreate in the beginning online, although we did manage it through some of the programs that we did. But actually what was really important when we were doing those online spaces, so we kind of did some design sprints around things that might help people who'd been bereaved or experiencing other living losses. So the Loss Project, whilst death and dying is a core part of it, we're interested in loss in all of its forms. And, the pandemic really walloped us with all manner of losses. But what was special about those spaces was that people came together in them and did an activity, whether it was individually making something but being in a collective space together, or working together on a task, but it was but doing it together that was really important and vital. And actually what started emerging was this sense of not being alone in that, and I think that was one of the things that was gained through that. The other thing that I think about loss and kind of gain, and I think when you're in the middle of loss, particularly if it is a death of a loved one, that can be a really difficult thing to be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't want to go there in terms of what I might have gained or where any transformative growth might come. I think that comes maybe a little bit further down the line, certainly in my own personal experiences. But particularly for the pandemic, we worked with some artists up in Scotland. We worked with charity workers who were working on the front line with people in communities. There was a sense of actually, there are some things that we are happy to have left behind, but that we've lost. And some of that, I think, comes back to what Aisha was saying about spaciousness. So in the pandemic, actually, people have more time. They were outside more, certainly in the UK anyway. People were out walking, people were tending to themselves in ways that perhaps they wouldn't have done when they were running around, taking the kids here and there, or going into the office every day. And there was something really beautiful in that, really beautiful in the noticing of what gifts the loss may have brought us, even though it may have been painful to get there. But also, I think, in terms of, there's kind of that abstract view of it, I suppose, but there is also just as creatives and artists and practitioners, the loss of work, the financial burden of that, the impact of kind of everything that was going on in the world, not just COVID-19 related, but there was a lot going on in that time, and there still is that kind of internal and external factors that kind of impede that sense of creativity. And I read something earlier, I can't remember where it was from now, but I can dig it out. It was saying, you're not lost your creativity. Creativity is innate within you. It's just that there are external factors or internal factors, perhaps, that are kind of hindering that inspiration or that spark or that motivation or whatever it might be. So, yeah, those are my initial thoughts. Really happy to hear Aisha and Mike's.
Yeah, Aisha, do you have anything to kind of speak to around being an artist, being a creative, like the past couple of years, and how that showed up for you or what that meant for you? I know it's a difficult topic, so how did that show up in your life?
Yeah, I think at least in the flow of work that I do as a public speaker and an artist, adaptability is a key word. And the pandemic has been no exception to that, although exceptional in some ways, although a lot of the inequalities and the discussions that have emerged onto headlines are things that we know are very historically rooted. So I think I definitely resonate with what you're saying, Carly, about kind of that feeling of loss. Also, in terms of so much of my work prior to the pandemic, for example, was very much in person, in the same room, holding the hands, doing, and then evolving that into different spaces. I think I kind of viewed it as a rebirthing process. Once I got a chance to kind of live through some of that spaciousness and see what I could compost of what was no longer working or serving the larger mission of challenging oppression with expression. And then kind of, birthing out a different kind of format for very similar creative flows. And what kind of surprised me during that time was how much I was called to then do more healing centered work that was part of, like, a thread of what I was doing before, but even more at the center to create spaciousness for grieving and for loss, also through music. That I think sometimes music and or storytelling can play with the taboo of what we talk about and what we don't talk about and what we process and what we don't process. Emotions, just feeling them, period, that sometimes as adults we get told to bottle it up, or we have some sort of pressure to do that. And that doesn't always allow us to then live both our fullest lives on a personal level, in my humble opinion. That's been my experience. And or like the connectivity that can happen within a group of people who might be grieving all sorts of different kinds of loss, both of loved ones and or lifestyle, all the different layers of that in the same space. They might not even realize that they have those connected experiences. And so that's part of why it's such a beautiful thing to be on a panel like this, because I can see the common threads of connecting people. And so that's essentially how I saw it come alive. And my work is really regrounding into what feels most important, and the collective healing practices. That healing is not necessarily just something that we do alone. It can be, there are things we can do on our own, but there's also a lot of power in us coming together and honing that by way of creative flows without having to be an artist or professional in that sense, can be a really powerful catalyst for people to release and transform and hopefully find a little bit of liberation amidst more challenging periods of their lives. Yeah.
Great. What about you, Mike?
Yeah, this is all good stuff. I agree with so much that I'm hearing, so I will be additive and not duplicative. And I think one of the things that crosses my mind as it relates to loss in general, actually, I'll start the opposite end. One of the things that crosses my mind as it relates to creativity and the human experience is that every day we are interpreting the world around us. We are making meaning out of everything happening to us that's happened in the past. We're making sense of our anxieties and thoughts and joys and hopes about the future and our fears about the future. We're a meaning-making machine. You know, the mechanics of our humanity. It's a phrase I use a lot in my work when I'm working with companies, where my team and I are working with companies, and we're getting them to try to understand that your humanity is one of the most early demands that is put on you in childhood, right? How many people have to interact with babies that can't fully communicate yet, and you're just like, I want you to talk, right? Or I want you to just, the hands, to give me something so I can stop the crying, or just something, right? And it's an interesting thing because I don't know that we're socialized well, I'll just speak for the context of American education and the way that we're raised and the way that we are thought of in the context of education, right? Like, we don't do like whole person education. It's very task and competency driven, which is, there's an element of that that's necessary, but we're all undereducated on what I would call the mechanics of our humanity, right? There are things that we think we have control over. There are things that we think we can opt out of, right? Like, people kind of operate in America as if, in a relationship, I can opt out of impacting your psychological development because that's just not a thing I want to pay attention to. That's not how being human works, right? And so teachers are like, oh, I don't want to deal with X and Y in this young person's life. It kind of doesn't matter, right? If it's in the dimension of what we would call human development, if it's biological, psychological, social, or in this dimension, the fourth dimension of meaning making, which they term spiritual here. So the biopsychosocial spiritual development is the health sciences model of human development. All four of those dimensions are subsumed in the other, and they're dynamic, meaning they influence each other. So we don't get to pick and choose how we impact somebody's humanity and their human development. Likewise, you don't get to pick and choose if you're going to make meaning out of a thing. You're going to make meaning out of something. And that in itself is a creative activity. And the beautiful part of that creative activity is that the more you get involved with it, the more you recognize that you can shift meaning. You can steer meaning towards something that promotes activity, or going back to that idea around creativity being generative, right? It's not stifling. What meaning can you derive and point yourself at that pushes you to be more connected, to be invested in self, to be invested in others, to ask new questions, right? Like, that's all within our power, although life can be organized around us in such ways that we feel robbed of that. And let's get into that loss part. And there's a brilliant man named Stephen Jenkinson who, if I'm not careful, I read his stuff or I'll watch a video of him and I'll just start crying. And there's nothing wrong with crying. But sometimes I gotta run to a thing and I'm like, I can't look like I was just crying. And people are like, are you okay? But I would read his stuff in chunks every day for a long period of time, because he's essentially, he's a psychotherapist who's also studied a lot of indigenous wisdom and medicines. And he's I guess his technical term would be a death doula. He's a death therapist. The comments and the wisdom that he shares on grief, I just want to read one simple quote that's not that simple. He says, grief is not a feeling, it is a capacity. It is not something that disables you. We are not on the receiving end of grief, we are on the practicing end of grief. He has these statements that make me go and I have to sit with them. The other one he talked about that really took me by the horns, I don't have horns, but if I did, they would grab me by the horns, was around the relationship between grief and joy. And that the seeds of the other, kind of like a yin-yang symbol, it exists like that for us. They're twins, fraternal twins, and the relationship they have with one another is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood relationships that we have, but there is no way to fully go through an entire grieving process without joy, right? And I was just like, oh gosh, and that we have to make space. You have to purposely make space for joy. And so when I think about creativity and loss, like those are the things that I wrestle with and like and sit with and think about in terms of operations and practice, and they get me to the next iterative question in my work and in my daily practice, but not always an answer, which I think is probably healthier in some cases, you know, but that's what, when I think about creative loss, that's all that like comes up for me.
Yeah, it's so much kind of exploratory work, really, I suppose, kind of what you're touching on. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Carly, on what Mike said about, you know, Stephen Jenkinson's kind of work and how he's approaching grief. And just from your own work with the Loss Project, how does that, the yin yang of grief and joy or being lost, work in your work?
Thank you. I was so excited for you to say that, Mike, because actually part of the work we've been doing in the UK is really pushing that narrative of joy and grief coexisting with each other, and that you can't have one without the other. But in the UK, at least, it seems like we're getting a much better at tending to the really painful bit, but actually we're not creating the spaces for the joy bit, and people are getting stuck almost from what I'm seeing in our work, at least. And actually I wanted to share the work of Martine Prechtel, who sounds very aligned with, was it Stephen Jenkinson? And so he wrote a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, and Martine says, in every case where grief and praise are still honoured, there is one aspect that remains the same with all people. Grief, even for an individual's loss, is a thing for which a lot of people are necessary. And this comes after a whole amazing exploration into Indigenous wisdoms and rituals, and creating that space for grief and praise. And but also it links back to what we were saying before about this aspect of connectivity within all of this, that it is both an individual and a collective journey. And sometimes I think there's an imbalance in being able to kind of hold all of those moving parts together. But I'd really recommend his work. It really has inspired me. But also I think sometimes people can be a bit scared to go to the joy place in the grief, because they're like, oh, I'm not sad enough, I haven't mourned enough, people are going to think I didn't love them, or you know, even maybe the other conversations I've been having recently is that not all bereavements, not all deaths are with people that you love and have a great relationship with. You know, we're complex humans. Sometimes people have died, we may well love them, but also equally we may not have had a great relationship with them. And then what do you do about joy and exploring all of that? So yeah, I think it's a very complex area. But in all of the work we do in the Loss Project, and this is one of the reasons why I think creativity in the arts is so special, is, like I said at the beginning, it enables a space for people to be able to unlock the space and feel like they can enter into it without being affronted by the fears of kind of what will happen if they go there. And I think it also enables you to surface the unspeakable often. And whether that is through music or dance, movement, you know, being outside in nature, or you know, we use collage a lot actually, because we found that everyone will turn up to a workshop and say, oh, I'm not creative, I can't draw, I won't be able to do this, it's going to be rubbish. But actually, if you get people to work with pre-existing images, then that fear is taken away. I mean, we do actually get people to draw, and inevitably the people who are like, I can't do it, create the most powerful, amazing pieces. And you know, it's not about the outcome, it's about the process, but nevertheless it is always beautiful. But the imagery work, I use a coaching tool that uses collage, and it's all about kind of connecting into your subconscious and allowing the images to kind of come through and to tap into that. And that's been another really interesting way of being able to hold this kind of seemingly complicated and maybe uncomfortable space of grief and praise and joy. Yeah.
Aisha, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the loss gain transformative aspect that this process may unfold for you as an individual or as an artist?
Ooh, wow, there's so many things that are coming to mind.
Just a light question. Yeah, well, just a gentle one.
I mean, so one of the images that was just coming to mind is today I visited this beautiful UNESCO cemetery here in Stockholm, and there were a series of funerals that were happening at the same time. And one funeral had just kind of concluded, at least what was happening inside the building, and people started coming out, and you saw people grieving, you saw people praying, and then you saw kids running out of the chapel and like, you know, playing tag, throwing leaves and giggling and all those things. And then I looked up and I saw all these beautiful autumn fall leaves and all the colors and just the season of autumn, like both the decay and that transition that's happening right before our eyes, and the beauty of that. People often like, oh, so, and at the same time, for me, that kind of becomes a metaphor for some of this joy and loss and how we can hold those things, or at least how I try to understand those things together. And then it's actually kind of part and parcel to the seasons of being a human being in my humble experience. And the only other thing that was coming to mind is, you know, I think as someone who focuses a lot on the human voice and just thinking about a lot of the more trauma-centered approaches that I've been studying up on and all the things, I think a lot about the layers of a voice. And it seems to me that there's an inner voice, often that more intuitive, maybe you could equate it to that. There's also an inner voice of how we actually hear our own like vocal cords. And I don't know if you ever heard your voice back on a recording or a message machine or whatever, but then there's also that like the projected voice in the space. And there's another layer of voice besides that kind of inner intuitive and then the projected voice, which is kind of you're imagining the sound. You're imagining, I'm thinking, Carly, of that imagery. Maybe there's an imagined imagery that before anything even gets put onto paper or expressed, there's like a kind of a precipice point. And I think that those layers come to mind when I think about navigating grief and loss, is building an awareness, perhaps a mindful awareness of those layers of the voice and how that might be able to allow us to connect more deeply both with ourselves and the power of our voice that sometimes can get even physically very tight when we feel the tears or all the emotions, the joy, all the things, you know, it can kind of, so to bring that awareness both as an individual and how that awareness can also allow us to expand and connect and to notice what's happening with one another and not feel completely stuck sometimes in the trauma response that can sometimes block the voice from being able to both share and or be reciprocal and listen to one another deeply. I think those are just some themes that are coming to mind as I hear this beautiful discussion unfolding.
Yeah, like I said, so much to unpack where to even start. And I would love to, personally, would just love to hear your perspectives on like the concept of being lost. Like if we're talking about creative loss, oh my gosh, but about being lost and living in the moment, shedding the past, mindfulness, the kind of the intricacies of that space. And sometimes, like, you know, that cliche of when you're lost, you get found. And I don't mean it like that, but I just mean like how to sit in that feeling lost or feeling stuck phase, but how that can also be exploratory, I guess. So, and how that maybe has shown up in your work or how that has been reflected in your work. And Mike, I'm gonna call on you and land you with that one. But I'd love to hear a little bit more maybe about your work with Humanature or your previous work with trauma and recovery, and how that's shown up when you're lost or you're stuck. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I part of my own personal like life practice goes back to that practice of curiosity. I lead with questions, right? Because I think I grew up feeling a bit lost, right? If I just reflect on life, let me rephrase that. I felt disoriented, right? Which is, it's not exactly lost, but you start to feel like you can't place yourself somewhere, anywhere, and you can't make sense of things in a certain kind of way that you're like seeking to. And so I found myself asking questions, and the activity and pursuit of answering those questions was very helpful because it helped me feel found, or it helped me orient myself. I might not have had full answers, but all of a sudden I wasn't like, oh, anymore, right? And so I, I welcome the practice of curiosity all the time, and I share that with people, and we do that with Humanature. We might start with clients on what, sourcing for them. What's the problem you're trying to solve, or what do you think is at the root of what's happening, etc. And then we spend a lot of time in discovery. We are practicing curiosity, and often we're working with them to scaffold and show them how to do that, to start to build the muscle of sitting in ambiguity, but learning at the same time and being okay with that, and learning how to build a life that's centered on iteration and questions and curiosity, learning to bring that into your practice at work, into your practice with family, with your friends, etc. We want so much to exist in a world that is absolutely binary, that has really, simple concretes. It's this or that. We love that technology is built on, if you will, this binary code. So it's like everything has to be binary. But look how much diversity we get out of technology with this binary code, right? Like, it's not a one-to-one that like everything has to be this or that. It's black or white, and that's all, right? And I don't mean in terms of race, but I mean in terms of like it's clearly A or it's clearly B. There's so much gradients in the middle between those spaces, or those polar ends. But if you don't have the muscle to sit in that ambiguity, if you don't have the muscle to, and not just the muscle, if you don't have the proper lenses available to you to purposefully, and mental models really, to purposely be stepping in and out of, because you recognize like, hey, the way I'm thinking about this, it's got me in this spot. I'm gonna have to purposely pick up a different lens, purposely pick up a different process and do it. And I might not be the most comfortable doing it at the moment, but it's not threatening me, it's not killing me. I'm just uncomfortable. And so I think it's also important that as you're going through these journeys, being able to delineate what's discomfort versus a lack of safety, because they're not exactly the same thing, and they don't exactly go hand in hand all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to sit in that kind of space, make those delineations so you can stay in it and stay going through the process and being comfortable with what emerges, and learning not to judge yourself. That's a really simple but hard way to get found if you feel lost, right? Is to release judgment, to practice grace and compassion with yourself, to practice curiosity with yourself, right? And by doing that, you can start to have a space that was foreign and almost harmful to you. And I mean just the space of life you're in, not like your workspace specifically. Just the space of your life in that feels foreign and harmful, dangerous, uncomfortable, etc. All of a sudden, it starts to shift into something that is holding you. And you start to realize the creative power you have to shape that spot around you. And you start to realize that I can find respite in self, because I have crafted and created something for myself, something for my team, something for my company that is totally informed by these mechanics of our humanity that I've been pointing out just now, but also informed by me.
Yeah.
I found me in the midst of trying to
Yeah.
get to all of that. But that's my long-winded answer to
the kind of self-discovery aspect of it. And I know we're Gardy, we've mentioned a few like quotes of books we've been reading, and we've been peppering in like quotes and stuff. And to kind of spin off that, I've been reading Rebecca Solnit's A Field Guide to Getting Lost recently, and I'm a big Solnit fan, so I'm sure she's been overquoted. But one quote, like one thing that just sprang to mind when you were chatting there, Mike, was she's talking about living in uncertainty and mystery. And so I'm going to read this one to you, and then I'll shut up and pass over to Carly and Aisha. But she says, to lose yourself, a voluptuous surrender, lost in your arms, lost to the world, utterly immersed in what is present so that its surroundings fade away. In Benjamin's terms, to be lost is to be fully present, and to be fully present is to be capable of being in uncertainty and mystery. And I remember when I was reading that, I was reading it on like an ebook reader. I was like highlighting frantically. And so, yeah, I just wanted to land that in the middle of the conversation because it kind of just speaks to that uncertainty and self-discovery that you were talking about, Mike. But yeah, over to you, Aisha or Carly, if you have anything to talk about in the kind of concept of being lost or being stuck, and the wayfinding, the sense making, all of that happens in that space.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, again, so much resonated then. And I think, you know, when grief and creativity and all of the things that we're talking about, it's a human practice. You don't need to be a professional to investigate these. We're talking about the human condition and being human. And but I think perhaps maybe in modern or Western culture, we've kind of lost that intentionality to be able to go to these uncomfortable places because it's really hard. And we see that perhaps we've lost some of the rituals that help us to journey through grief and the complexities that surround us. And I think maybe that's why some of the different phases of grief and loss can kind of fall by the wayside in a way. But I mean, what I always say on repeat all of the time is that I think you kind of put it in a similar way, Mike, but that flexing the muscle of being able to sit comfortably in discomfort. And it is a really hard thing to do. Like, it's so easy to sit here and say, oh yeah, well, you know, it's an intentional practice and we're all going to be uncomfortable and we're just going to sit with it. But it's really hard. It's really hard to do it. And I think that that can also lead to that sense of feeling lost or stuck. And what I really enjoy, and one of the reasons why I created the Loss Project, was to find these alternative ways, rituals, spaces, alternative spaces, to be able to explore this stuff, to be able to journey through it together for your own individual self, because obviously it's all such an individual experience, but there are ways that we can journey through it collectively too. And actually, you know, one of the reasons why I started the Loss Project was through my own transformative experience of loss. And when I think about loss, you know, really it's change. It's how, again, another part of being human is how do we deal with and how do we approach change? And, you know, loss can, I don't like to talk about loss in any hierarchical way, but, you know, it can be to a bigger extent or another. But I am always really interested to lean into that transformative aspect of loss, about how the losses that I've experienced in my life at various stages have been platforms and catalysts for the emergence of a new version of me almost. But I've had to be able to really sit with the really uncomfortable, rocky, horrible times at times, to be able to kind of go through that. But I've been lucky that I've always had a curious nature about loss, where I wanted to go there and explore it. And I think, again, that's why having more people collectively who feel comfortable exploring this stuff means that societally, hopefully, there'll be more of a move to be able to journey through that together. Anyway, Aisha, let me hand over to you. I'm rambling away.
Not at all. I'm just letting it all soak in. I keep thinking of the word control, because I think when it comes to this topic, there's a lot in our relationship too with control, and what feels within our control, what feels out of our control, and a lot of the energy that goes in sort of, sometimes loss and grief can feel like waves, or, it's not always a linear process. And that adds to this like level of, feeling like things are beyond one's control. And so for me, some of that mystery that we're talking about in terms of both the feeling of loss and or feeling lost in some shape or form is also changing my own relationship with, what it means to know when or accept when things are beyond one's control or my own control. And that actually can be an amazing space for creativity, which I think brings us in a way full circle to the beginning of our conversation, that creative force can sometimes be a venue to pour some of that energy that is flowing when we're not able to control the things into actually generating something in the face of destruction and or loss and or huge transition. So I think all of that resonates, and I think I'm very curious and open and excited to see how much it almost feels like, I don't know if you've ever been in a band room and if you kind of tap a drum and then all of a sudden other instruments start to vibrate and they make a hum or a sound. And I think sometimes when we're able to open the portals like each of you does, and I humbly think that I do in some of my work, to have these conversations, that suddenly all the instruments in the room or all the resonant places in us start to vibrate, and you can really see how much people are illuminated by being able to connect. And that gives me a lot of hope, actually, for the way forward with all that we've gone through, not only in the last few years, but even beyond that, and these chapters ahead amidst all of the change and loss that is continuing to unfold. So that's what's coming to my mind.
That's great. And like we've been saying, there's just so much to unpack in this topic, and it touches on so many different parts of our lives and our work. And I feel like, as always with these virtual events, we're only scratching the surface. So I would love to see another version of this event, just to keep it as maybe a topic that we touch on again sometime in the new year or later next year. This is always a good time. Autumn is like a transition time, as you said, like we're entering this new season of the year, maybe new season of our life. I always think of September as this back to school, new stationery, new mindset, shifting gears. So it's felt very timely and appropriate. I would love to close us out today because we're drawing towards the end, and I'm good to wind down the conversation. But I would love to maybe in the chat for our attendees joining us, maybe if you could pop in what your key takeaway is from this conversation, or maybe something that you're thinking on, ruminating over, want to think about during the next week or bring forward into your work. And then for our speakers, I would love to hear more about just quickly what's next for you in this space, or if there is anything next for you in this space. Maybe you're just thinking, maybe new projects. So I'm gonna go to you, Carly, first.
Thank you, Claire. And yeah, a big thank you to the RSA US and Aisha and Mike, because this has been an amazing conversation, and I could literally sit here for hours chatting through all of this with you and Claire. So a massive thank you. It has really energized and inspired me today. For the Loss Project, we actually have a collaborative project with the Fandango Kid. You'll have seen some of the information on the Eventbrite. The dumpster is in Brookfield Place. It is there. It starts today. It's a converted dumpster that's being made into an ice cream kiosk that's aiming to smash the taboos of grief and loss. And we've curated a therapeutic program of creative activities, talks, all sorts of stuff, to support people with grief and loss. And more of the same, really, more of exploring how creativity, nature, movement can create rituals to journey through grief, and possibly a disco kiosk and grief raves in the new year with Annie the Fandango Kid as a way of expressing grief and joy. So yeah, that's what we're up to.
Oh, I love it. If we could have a virtual rave, count me in. Mike, I know you have to dash in a minute, so I'm going to hand over to you. And Aisha, probably the same, to run. If you quickly have a what's next for you, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm really working at the intersections of systems, policy design, and then what does that mean for the organizations and companies that move any of life forward for people, really around this weird relationship to income access, right? So much of the losses we experience in America have to do with the fact that people cannot afford to live. And so you are constantly, talk about creativity, I mean, you are constantly on a daily trying to figure out, how do I just show up and how can I get through the day? And so I like to use this phrase, developmentally appropriate policy. Like, that's a big part of my life's goal and journey here, is that policy has got to catch up to the reality of the sciences of being human, right? Of what loss means, of what all of these things we're talking about today mean. How should HR policy look in that context? What should educational policy look like in that context? How should we be thinking about dollars that are getting invested through a public health lens into things like the social determinants of health? What's an employer's responsibility to the social determinants of health in a city like Philadelphia, where we're experiencing record levels of gun violence? We have an opioid epidemic that is probably the largest on the East Coast. We have the largest open air drug market on the East Coast as it relates to opioids. Like, what young people and families and people are experiencing in this city is wild, and we have no policies that are developmentally appropriate across the lifespan. That's where my work is pushing, is like the white papers around that, but also working with the employers and these other people in the ecosystem that don't, of like living, if you will, that don't think about themselves as being part and parcel to that, but completely are.
Thanks, Mike. That's great, and I can't wait to hear what's next for you. Aisha, if you have anything quickly to add to that, that would be really great.
Absolutely. Wow. So I think, given the work that I do with storytelling and music and all of the things, I view those kind of portals as ways to be able to shift culture and to shift the mindsets, and from there, the actions that we can take, given that activism is a daily choice. So I continue to plan to do that by way of speaking and performing and writing a book that's underway. I also have an album that I've been working on for quite some time, and I think is just at the kind of the precipice of being ready, that I think, both in terms of some of the audio sounds, as well as some of the lyrical content, interweaves the joy, the grief, the loss. And I hope that it will continue to kind of create a forum, a space for people to not only find release, but to also find connection within themselves and with one another in live spaces, whether that be virtual or in person. So I plan to continue doing this work, and hopefully planting seeds along the way for other folks to continue and to have enough compassion as well as courage to feel like they can also do this work in capacities that feel good for them. Thank you so much for today and this wonderful conversation.
I know, it's been great. And I feel gutted that some folks got to join it late. And so I'm so sorry that you missed the conversation. And Gardy, thank you for your comment. That's just great to nourish our creative practice, our creative selves. And so I wanted to thank you all for your time. Mike, Aisha, and Carly, it's been lovely collaborating with you. All of you who've registered via Eventbrite will get an access to the recording of this conversation. So Norwood, you will, for sure. And I'll be in touch via email tomorrow. I'll be sharing links such as like Aisha, Carly, and Mike's details, as well as Aisha's song that we talked about during the event, and some of the books that and authors that we referenced. So thank you so much again and again, and hopefully we keep this conversation going and we see each other again soon. So thank you, have a wonderful afternoon, evening, and good night if you're on British time or somewhere in Europe, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Thank you so much.